The child arrived on a Tuesday at approximately 1400 hours. Later, when the incident was being reviewed by 3 separate oversight bodies and one very uncomfortable diplomatic panel, the question of how a 2-year-old human child had accessed the Valith Sovereignty's 3rd Fleet Strategic Command Center would produce a report that was 47 pages long, and that ultimately concluded with the specific institutional language of bodies that have been forced to explain something genuinely inexplicable. That the access had occurred through a combination of factors, no single one of which was individually sufficient to have produced the outcome, but that had combined, on this particular Tuesday, into a sequence of events that the Third Fleet's security protocols had not been designed to prevent, because the protocols had been designed by people who had not considered the scenario. The scenario was a toddler. Her name was Myra Osai. She was 27 months old. She was the daughter of Lieutenant Commander Deo Osai, who was the Third Fleet's liaison officer for human affairs, and who was one of approximately 40 humans currently stationed at the Sovereignty's command installation as part of the joint operations framework that the Conclave's collective security arrangement had produced. Lieutenant Commander Osai was a competent officer and a careful parent, and was, on this particular Tuesday, in a briefing that had run 40 minutes over its scheduled end time in a room on the installation's 3rd level. His daughter was supposed to be in the installation's family support facility on the 7th level with the childcare staff, who were present specifically to address this kind of scheduling conflict. She was not in the family support facility on the 7th level. She was in the Strategic Command Center on the 2nd level. The path between the 7th level and the 2nd level was not direct. It passed through 3 security checkpoints, 2 elevator systems, a maintenance corridor, and a restricted access vestibule. The security checkpoints were staffed. The elevator systems required access codes. The maintenance corridor was locked. The restricted access vestibule required biometric clearance. The review report's 47 pages were largely devoted to the question of how Myra Osai had passed through all of these. The short answer, which the 47 pages arrived at and then spent considerable space contextualizing, was that she had not passed through them in the conventional sense. She had been assisted through most of them by beings who had encountered a small human child in a corridor, and had done what beings did when they encountered a small human child in a corridor, which was to assume that the child had a reason for being where she was and to be helpful. The first checkpoint officer had opened the gate because the child had walked up to it and looked at him, and he had assumed she was with the group of officers who had just passed through ahead of her, and whom he had waved through without individual scanning because they were senior staff whose faces he knew. The elevator had been summoned and held open by a maintenance technician who had seen the child standing in front of it looking at the buttons, and had pressed the button for her, and held the door until she was inside because this seemed like the helpful thing to do. The maintenance corridor lock had been opened by a supply officer who had been coming the other direction and who had held the door as she exited, and Myra had walked through the held door with the confident purposefulness that toddlers deployed when they were going somewhere, and that adults consistently interpreted as having a reason for going there. The restricted access vestibule's biometric clearance requirement had been bypassed when the duty officer had stepped out of the vestibule to take a communication and had left the inner door open, which was a protocol violation that the duty officer had not considered significant because the vestibule was already past 3 security checkpoints, and who was going to be in the vestibule who should not be there. The answer on this particular Tuesday was Myra Osai. She had walked through the open inner door while the duty officer was on his communication, and had emerged into the 3rd Fleet Strategic Command Center at approximately 1400 hours, and had looked around at the largest and most sophisticated military command facility she had ever been in, which was also the only military command facility she had ever been in, and had done what 2-year-olds did when they found themselves in an interesting new environment. She had started exploring. Fleet Commander Veth Ondar was in the middle of a strategic assessment briefing when he became aware that something had changed in the room. The change was not dramatic. His senior staff were all present and the briefing was ongoing, and the holographic displays were showing the tactical situation in the contested corridor, and the assessment was proceeding as assessments proceeded. The change was in the peripheral quality of the room's attention, a subtle reorientation of where people were looking that was not toward the displays, but toward something to his left. He looked to his left. There was a child standing next to the primary tactical console. She was very small. She was wearing what the childcare facility's records would later confirm was a yellow garment with a pattern on it that the records described as decorative, but that Ondar's subsequent inquiry into human culture would inform him was a popular children's character from an Earth entertainment program. She had dark hair and the specific exploratory expression of a being who has found something interesting and is deciding what to do about it. She was looking at the tactical console. The tactical console was displaying the Third Fleet's current deployment positions and the contested corridor's strategic geometry and the movement projections for the next 48 hours. It was the most sensitive tactical information in the Third Fleet's current operational picture, and it was on a display that was at approximately the eye level of a 2-year-old who was standing next to it. Ondar said, in the sudden quiet of a briefing room that had noticed what he had noticed, "What is that?" His aide, a meticulous officer named Prieth who had been in his service for 6 years, and who was very good at anticipating what Ondar needed and was, in this moment, experiencing a genuine failure of that anticipation, said, "Commander, that is a child." Ondar said, "I can see it is a child. Why is there a child in the Strategic Command Center?" Prieth said, "I do not know, Commander." Ondar said, "Find out." He said it in a tone that communicated that finding out was a matter of some urgency. Prieth moved immediately toward the door to find out. While Prieth was finding out, the child had made a decision about what to do about the interesting display she had been looking at. She reached up and touched it. The tactical console was a touch-sensitive display. It was designed to respond to the input of authorized operators using authorized interaction protocols. It was not designed to prevent input from unauthorized operators, because the console was behind 3 security checkpoints, 2 elevator systems, a maintenance corridor, and a restricted access vestibule, and the people who had designed the console's interaction protocols had not considered the possibility of an unauthorized operator who was 27 months old and curious about buttons. The child touched the display. The display responded. It responded by doing what touch-sensitive displays did when touched, which was to register the input and produce an output, and the output it produced was a zoom function on the tactical map, which expanded the view of the contested corridor's northern sector to full display width. The child watched this happen. She touched the display again in a different place. The display zoomed in further on a subsector of the northern corridor. She made a sound that Ondar's translation implant rendered as an expression of satisfaction. She touched the display a 3rd time. Tactical Officer Keth, who had been watching this from his station with the expression of someone whose professional training had not included a protocol for this scenario, said, "Commander, she is navigating the tactical display." Ondar said, "I can see that." Keth said, "She appears to be zooming in on the Keth 7 approach vector." Ondar said, "I can see that as well." The child zoomed in further on the Keth 7 approach vector. Then she appeared to lose interest in the approach vector and touched a different area of the display, which was the deployment positions of the Third Fleet's primary formation. Keth said, "She is now examining the primary formation's deployment positions." Ondar said, "Yes." Keth said, "Should I remove her from the console?" Ondar looked at the child. The child was looking at the display with the focused attention of a being who was genuinely engaged with what she was looking at. She had not damaged anything. She had not produced any output that the tactical team could not immediately identify and assess. She was exploring the display with the specific thoroughness of someone who found it interesting. He said, "Not yet." Keth said, "Commander." He said, "Not yet." He watched. The child navigated the display for another 3 minutes. She examined several sectors. She zoomed in on what Undar recognized as the installation's own position. She zoomed out to the full corridor view. She found a control that cycled through the fleet's individual vessel positions and cycled through 4 of them with a methodical quality that Undar found, despite everything, oddly impressive. Then she sat down on the floor. She sat down with the decisive quality of someone who had decided that sitting was now the appropriate activity, and had implemented the decision immediately and completely. She looked up at Tactical Officer Keth, who was the nearest person to her. She said something. Keth's translation implant rendered it. He looked at Undar. He said, "Commander, she says she is hungry." Undar looked at the child sitting on the floor of the 3rd Fleet's Strategic Command Center. He said, "Is there food in this facility?" Keth said, "There is a nutrition station in the adjacent corridor." Undar said, "Go and get something appropriate for a human child of her age. I have no idea what that is. Ask whoever is at the nutrition station." Keth said, "Yes, Commander." He went. Undar looked at the rest of his senior staff, who were looking at him with a collective expression that combined the professional composure of senior military officers with the specific quality of people who were in a situation that their professional composure had not been built to cover. He said, "The briefing is paused. Priyeth is determining how this child came to be here. In the interim, we will address the situation in front of us. Are there any questions?" His intelligence officer said, "Commander, the diplomatic implications of a human child accessing the Strategic Command Center and interacting with the tactical display." Undar said, "Yes, I am aware of the diplomatic implications. We will address them after we address the immediate situation." His intelligence officer said, "The immediate situation being the child." Undar said, "The immediate situation being the child, yes." He walked over to where the child was sitting on the floor. He crouched down, which brought him closer to her eye level, which was a significant adjustment given his height relative to hers. He said, "I am Commander Undar." The child looked at him. She said his name back to him, approximately. Her rendering of Undar came out as something closer to Andu, which his translation implant flagged as a diminutive approximation, and which Undar filed as the first time in 23 years of military command that anyone had produced a diminutive approximation of his name. He said, "What is your name?" She said, "Myra." He said, "Myra, do you know where your parent is?" She said, "Daddy is in a meeting." He said, "Yes, we are going to find your daddy. Are you okay?" She considered this question with the specific seriousness that 2-year-olds applied to questions they were taking seriously. She said, "I'm hungry." He said, "We are getting you something to eat." She said, "Okay." She looked at him with the direct and complete attention that small children applied to adults they had decided were worth looking at. She said, "You're big." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you in charge?" He said, "Of this room, yes." She said, "I'm in charge of my room at home." He said, "That is an important responsibility." She considered this. She said, "I have a fish." He said, "A fish." She said, "His name is Captain." He said, "That is an appropriate name for a fish in a military household." She looked at him. She said, "You're funny." He was not certain this was a characterization he had previously received from anyone. He said, "Thank you." Keth returned with items from the nutrition station. He had communicated with the nutrition station staff and had returned with something that the staff had confirmed was appropriate for human children of approximately 2 years of age, which was a small container of a soft food substance and a container of a liquid. He gave them to Andar. Andar gave them to Myra. Myra accepted them with the efficiency of someone who had assessed the situation and determined that the food was acceptable. She began eating. She ate with the focused concentration of a 2-year-old engaged in eating, which was total. Around her, the 3rd Fleet Strategic Command Center continued to exist, its displays showing the contested corridor, its staff standing at their stations or sitting in their chairs with the specific quality of a room that was waiting for something to be resolved. Priyeth returned. She said quietly to Andar, "The child is the daughter of Lieutenant Commander Deo Osai, the Human Affairs Liaison. He is currently in a briefing on the 3rd level that has run over schedule. We have sent someone to retrieve him. ETA approximately 12 minutes. Andar said, "How did she get here?" Priyeth said, "I have the preliminary account. It is going to produce a significant security review." He said, "Yes, I expect it will." She said, "Commander, the diplomatic dimension." He said, "I am aware of the diplomatic dimension." She said, "The child has accessed and interacted with the tactical display." He said, "I know, I watched it happen." She said, "The information on the display at the time of her interaction included current deployment positions and movement projections." He said, "I know." She said, "The implications for the operational security framework." He said, "Priyeth, she is 2 years old." She said, "Yes, Commander." He said, "She zoomed in on the Keth 7 approach vector and then sat on the floor and asked for food." She said, "Yes." He said, "I do not believe the operational security framework is compromised by her interaction with the display." She said, "No, I suppose not." He said, "The security review will address how she got here. The operational security question is, in my assessment, not the primary concern." She said, "What is the primary concern?" He said, "The primary concern is that there is a 2-year-old child sitting on the floor of the Strategic Command Center eating her afternoon food, and we need to make sure she is comfortable and her parent gets here soon." Priyeth said, "Yes, Commander." She looked at Myra, who had finished the soft food and was now examining the empty container with the methodical interest that she had previously applied to the tactical display. She said she is very calm. Andar said, "Yes." She said, "Most beings her age, in an unfamiliar environment with unfamiliar beings, would be distressed." He said, "Yes." She said, "She does not appear distressed." He said, "No." She said, "She appears to be having a normal afternoon." He looked at Myra, who had put down the food container and was now looking at the room with the calm, comprehensive attention that she had been applying to everything since she arrived. He said, "Yes, she does." He said, "Priyeth, what is the human developmental literature on this, on children this age in unfamiliar environments?" Priyeth said, "I can run a search." He said, "Run it." She ran it. The result came back while Myra was beginning a systematic examination of the leg of the nearest console, which appeared to have a texture she found interesting. Priyeth read the result. She said, "The literature indicates that human children at this developmental stage have a high tolerance for novelty and an exploratory orientation toward new environments. The absence of distress in unfamiliar situations is associated with secure attachment to a primary caregiver, which means the child has a fundamental confidence that the caregiver will return, which allows her to engage with the new environment rather than focus on the absence of the caregiver." She said, The literature also notes that human children at this age have not yet developed the social cognition to assess strangers as threats in the way that older children and adults do. They approach unfamiliar beings with a fundamentally non-threatening assumption, unless there are specific behavioral signals that override it. Andar said, "She is not afraid of us because she does not yet know to be afraid of us." Priyath said, "That is one interpretation, yes." He said, "And the exploratory orientation," she said, "is characteristic of the developmental stage. Children this age learn about their environment through direct exploration." The touch-sensitive display was within her reach, and she interacted with it because interaction is how she investigates new things. He said, "She investigated our tactical display the same way she would investigate anything else in a new environment." Priyath said, "From a developmental standpoint, yes." He said, "Because for her there is no categorical difference between a tactical display and anything else in a new room." Priyath said, "She does not have the categorical framework that makes a tactical display different from other interesting things yet." Yes. Andar looked at the child, who had finished examining the console leg, and was now standing up and looking at the room with the expression of someone deciding what to investigate next. She looked at him. She said, "What's that?" She was pointing at the holographic tactical display in the center of the room, the full, three-dimensional representation of the contested corridor and its surrounding space. He said, "It is a map." She said, "A big map." He said, "Yes, a very big map." She said, "Can I see it?" He said, "It is for the fleet." She said, "What's a fleet?" He said, "Many ships together." She said, "Like a lot of ships?" He said, "Yes, a lot of ships." She said, "I like ships." He said, "Why do you like ships?" She said, "Because they go far away and then they come back." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes, that is what ships do." She said, "My daddy's on a ship sometimes." He said, "Yes." She said, "And he comes back." He said, "Yes." She said, "So I like ships." He looked at the 2-year-old who had navigated 3 security checkpoints, 2 elevator systems, a maintenance corridor, and a restricted access vestibule, and had arrived in the 3rd Fleet's Strategic Command Center, and had investigated the tactical display and sat on the floor and eaten her food, and was now telling him why she liked ships. He said, "Would you like to see the big map?" She said, "Yes, please." He picked her up. This was not a thing he had done in his military career. He had commanded fleets and conducted operations, and managed the strategic situation of a significant portion of the Valith sovereignty's military presence in this region. He had not previously picked up a 2-year-old. She was lighter than he expected, and she grabbed his uniform with both hands with the automatic grip of a child who had been picked up before and understood what was required of her in the process. He carried her to the holographic tactical display. She looked at it. She was quiet for a moment, which was the quiet of genuine engagement. She said, "It's all glowy." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are those the ships?" He said, "Yes, each light is a ship." She counted some of them. She counted to 4 and then lost the thread and started again from 1 and got to 6 and said, "That's a lot." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are they all coming back?" He said, "Yes, they are all coming back." She said, "Good." She looked at the display for another moment. She said, "Which one is my daddy's?" He said, "Your daddy is not on a ship right now. He is in a meeting." She said, "Oh." She said, "Are you going to get him?" He said, "Someone is getting him right now. He will be here soon." She said, "Okay." She leaned against him slightly with the comfortable weight of a child who had decided that this was an acceptable situation and that the adult currently holding her was adequate for the purpose. He stood at the holographic tactical display, of the Third Fleet's contested corridor operations, holding a 2-year-old who had decided he was adequate. His senior staff were at their stations. The room had the quality it had been having since 1400, which was the quality of a room that was waiting for something to resolve, and that had, in the waiting, arrived at a specific kind of stillness. Keth said, very quietly, to Thessaly, who was at the adjacent station, "This is the strangest briefing the Third Fleet has ever held." Thessaly said, equally quietly, "Yes." Keth said, "She's not afraid of him at all." Thessaly said, "No." Keth said, "He's not afraid of her either." Thessaly said, "No." Keth said, "He looks slightly less uncomfortable than he did 5 minutes ago." Thessaly said, "Yes." They watched their commander stand at the tactical display, holding a small human child, who was looking at the lights that represented the Third Fleet's ships and asking questions. Myra said, "What's that one?" Undar said, "That is the primary formation's lead vessel." She said, "The biggest." He said, "The biggest, yes." She said, "Is it fast?" He said, "Very fast." She said, "Faster than anything." He said, "Almost anything." She said, "What's faster?" He said, "A few things." She said, "Like what?" He said, "Some of Earth's ships are faster." She said, "My daddy's people." He said, "Yes, your daddy's people have some very fast ships." She said, "I know." He said, "You know." She said, "Daddy says Earth's ships are the fastest. He says it when he's proud." Undar looked at the holographic display. He thought about the strategic situation in the contested corridor, about the assessment briefing that had been paused, about the 48-hour movement projections and the operational picture, and everything that the Third Fleet's command function was supposed to be doing on this Tuesday afternoon. He thought about a 2-year-old who had walked through 3 security checkpoints and a maintenance corridor and a restricted access vestibule, and had ended up at the tactical display asking about ships and counting lights and leaning against him with the weight of someone who had decided this was acceptable. He thought about what it meant that the person in this room who was the least concerned about the situation was the one who had caused it. He thought about ships that went far away and came back. Lieutenant Commander Deo Os arrived at the Strategic Command Center at 14:27, which was 27 minutes after his daughter had arrived, and which was 6 minutes after Priath's 12-minute estimate, because the officer sent to retrieve him had needed to wait for a break in the briefing that Osai was in, and the briefing had not broken for 4 additional minutes after the officer arrived. Osai came through the door with the specific velocity of a parent who has been told that their child is somewhere their child should not be, and who has covered the distance to that somewhere at the maximum speed available to them, while maintaining the appearance of military bearing. He arrived at the door of the Strategic Command Center, and the door opened, and he saw the situation. The situation was his commanding officer standing at the holographic tactical display holding his daughter. Myra saw him. She said, "Daddy." She said it with the complete and total enthusiasm that 2-year-olds deployed when the caregiver they had been confident would return had returned. Osai crossed the room. He said, "Commander Undar, I apologize, I do not know how she." Undar transferred the child to her father. Myra grabbed Osai's uniform with the same automatic grip she had used on Undar's. Osai said, "Myra, how did you get here?" Myra said, "I walked." Osai said, "From the 7th level." Myra said, "The nice man opened the door." Osai closed his eyes for a moment. He said, "Commander, I apologize." Undar looked at him. He said, "Your daughter is very calm in unfamiliar environments." Osai said, "She is. She always has been." He said, "She explored the tactical display." Osai said, "Commander, I am so sorry. I will submit a full incident report." Undar said, She zoomed in on the Keth-7 approach vector. Osai said, "I." He said, "She said she likes ships because they go far away and come back." Osai was quiet for a moment. He said, "She does say that." Andar said, "And that Earth ships are the fastest." Osai said, "She hears me say that. I say it when I'm." He said proud, "Yes, she told me." He looked at Osai and Myra. Myra was now telling her father something about the big glowy map in the animated way of a 2-year-old who has had an interesting afternoon and is recounting it. Andar said, "Lieutenant Commander, the incident will require a security review. The review will likely produce protocol revisions." Osai said, "Yes, Commander, I understand." Andar said, "It will also require a diplomatic incident report given the joint operations framework and the sensitivity of what is in this facility." Osai said, "Yes, Commander." Andar said, "The diplomatic incident report will be accurate. It will describe what happened and what your daughter interacted with, and what the assessed implications are for operational security." Osai said, "Yes." Andar said, "The assessed implications for operational security are that there are no significant implications." She investigated the display. She did not produce any outputs that are not immediately identifiable and reversible. The information she was exposed to is not information she can communicate to anyone in any operationally relevant form. Osai said, "No, she cannot." Andar said, "She is 2 years old." Osai said, "Yes." Andar said, "The incident report will reflect all of this." He said, "The incident report will also reflect that the 3rd Fleet's Strategic Command Center was accessed by a 2-year-old human child, who was subsequently held by the fleet commander at the tactical display while she asked questions about ships." He said, "I will write that section myself." Osai said, "Commander." Andar said, "Yes." Osai said, "Thank you." Andar looked at Myra, who had finished her account of the afternoon and was now looking around the room with the comprehensive attention she had been applying to everything since she arrived. She looked at Andar. She said, "Bye, Andu." He said, "Goodbye, Myra." She said, "Tell Captain I said hi." He said, "Captain." Osai said, "She thinks everyone has a fish. She names the fish Captain." Andar said, "I do not have a fish." Myra looked at him with the specific expression of someone who has received information that requires processing. She said, "You should get one." He said, "I will consider it." She said, "They come back." He said, "Fish." She said, "Ships." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's good." He said, "Yes, it is." Osai carried her out. The door closed. The Strategic Command Center returned to the quality it had before 1400. Andar walked back to his position at the briefing display. He said, "Resume." His senior staff resumed. The briefing continued. The tactical situation in the contested corridor was what it was. The movement projections for the 48 hours ahead were what they were. The strategic assessment was what it was. Keth said, "Commander, do you want the tactical display restored to the pre-interaction configuration?" Andar looked at the display. Myra had left it zoomed in on the northern corridor sector. The full display width was showing a section of space that the pre-interaction configuration had shown at a smaller scale. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "Leave it." Keth said, "Commander." He said, "The view is actually more useful at this scale. Leave it." He said, "And someone find out if the nutrition station has anything appropriate for 2-year-old humans, in case this happens again." Thessaly said, very carefully, "In case this happens again, Commander." He said, "The family support facility's scheduling did not anticipate a briefing running 40 minutes over. If the scheduling produces this result again, I want to be prepared." he said, and tell the security division to review every checkpoint between the 7th level and this facility. He said, and to brief the staff on what a 2-year-old human child looks like, and to consider that a 2-year-old human child in a corridor might not have a reason for being there that the staff should facilitate. Priyath said, "Yes, Commander." He said, and add a fish tank to the facility requisition list. Everyone in the room looked at him. He said, for morale. Nobody said anything. He said, resume. They resumed. Outside in the corridor, Osei was carrying Myra toward the elevator. Myra was telling him about the big glowy map, and the nice big person, and the ships that go far away and come back. He said they all come back. Osei said, the commander said that. She said, I asked. He said, what did you ask? She said, I asked if the ships are all coming back, and he said yes. Osei was quiet for a moment. He said, and you believed him? She said, yes. He said, why? She said, because he looked like the kind of person who knows. Osei looked at his daughter. He thought about the kind of person who knows. He thought about commanders and fleets and contested corridors, and the strategic situation, and the diplomatic incident report he was going to have to write. He thought about his daughter in the arms of the 3rd Fleet's commanding officer at the tactical display asking about ships. He thought about what it meant that she had walked through 3 security checkpoints and a maintenance corridor and an access vestibule, and had ended up at the center of the thing, and had been met there with fish crackers, and an explanation of what a fleet was, and a lift to see the big glowy map. He thought about ships that went far away and came back. He said, you're right, he is. Myra said, I know. She leaned against him. He carried her to the elevator. The door opened. He pressed the button for the 7th level. The door closed. They went up.